Death records, it's all about death. Yes, I'm wearing black. So, what death records have you overlooked? What death records may exist that you're not thinking about, or that may help you figure out somebody's death if you don't already know it? I'm Aimee Cross, and today we're going to talk about this and more, records that pertain to death and how you can find them for your family members. I'm here to help you take your genealogy to the next level. So let's go. Death certificates, at least in the United States, really didn't start until about the turn of the 20th century. I always get that confused. Do you get that confused? Anyway, a lot of states started requiring them in about 1915, but a lot of states didn't have real compliance until like 1925. So that's something to keep in mind. Now, some places did have death registers or some other type of death certificate. So if you do have somebody that died previous to that time, you still might find something, but you might not. And a lot of people get really frustrated when they're looking for something like a death certificate and they can't find it. So let's talk a little bit about what some of the other options are. Now, other death records can be cemetery records or mortuary records or obituaries or probate records or things like that. I'm going to go into each one of those a little bit more detail and talk about them and some others as well. But let me go back now to death certificates, because a lot of people don't look at those really carefully, and there may be more. You may not have found all that you could find even if you have a death certificate. So in this example, you see that they've listed the place of burial, the Masonic Cemetery of Cedar Bayou, and the funeral home, the Undertaker, Tri-Cities Funeral Home. And they even have the address of the funeral home, 401 West Pierce Street. Now, in this death certificate, you see that they were buried in Glenwood Cemetery, and they give you the date of burial. And then the Undertaker, which is a little bit more difficult to read, but you have their address. So I could go into a city directory and I could find out more about that Undertaker if I can't quite read the name on the death certificate because I have the address. So I can put those things together. City directories can be really helpful when you're looking for mortuaries or Undertakers. So don't neglect those other parts of a death certificate that you may not have been paying attention to. Now let's talk about cemeteries. Now, cemeteries have been around for centuries. The place of burial is considered sacred, and so they have been probably better preserved than a lot of other types of records and a lot of other things, except for now, right? Because people like to go into graveyards and knock over some headstones, which is so dumb. But that's another talk altogether. So anyway, we do have a lot of headstones, but sometimes they've been damaged and you can't see them, or they've just worn away with time. So what are things that you can do when you've maybe done a search for cemeteries and you're not finding what you're looking for? First off, let me tell you where to search for cemeteries. Look at Find a Grave, look at Billion Graves, and then also go to the FamilySearch cemetery search function, which kind of combines both of those two sites as well as some additional things. That's under FamilySearch, Search, and Cemeteries. Sometimes, maybe even 100 years ago, somebody made a listing of all the people that were buried in a particular cemetery, which maybe now those headstones don't exist. And you want to look for those at genealogical societies, historical societies. FamilySearch has some books and things like that in their catalogs. Local public libraries, state archives. So check for those. If you can find the cemetery, then contact them because they may have additional records. Or maybe your family member was buried in a cemetery in an unmarked grave, and while you don't see a headstone, there is actually a burial record for them. I have that in my family. Most people do. So contact the cemetery, and they're usually pretty nice about giving you the information. Now, what if you don't know what cemetery somebody was buried in? Then look at those city directories and see the cemeteries that are in the areas where they lived, or look at even a current modern day map and look for cemeteries around where your family resided at the time of their death. Now, if your cemetery does not have a current office, there's really nobody that you can contact for the cemetery that you're interested in, contact City Hall. Because if there isn't anybody managing that cemetery, the city is usually managing it. And frequently they have maps to the cemeteries that tell you where different people are buried. And a lot of people don't realize to get in touch with City Hall. And finally, I have to say, don't neglect going to the cemetery and visit the cemetery, because you don't know who is buried around your family member or maybe when you show up in person to a cemetery, they're going to be more willing to help you out. So I really advocate going to the cemetery. And if your ancestor's headstone has not been included on Find a Grave or Billion Graves, while you're there, you can take the photo and upload it for everybody else. All right, our next record is church records. Now, churches frequently hold records for cemeteries on their property, or they may have death records for a parishioner. So if you know the church that your family attended, definitely see if you can find them, or you can just look and see what churches were around in the area where your family member lived. Let's talk a little bit more about funeral homes, because funeral homes are something that a lot of people don't think about contacting. And funeral homes or undertakers can be really valuable records. Now, again, sometimes those records are gone. They may have been destroyed. They're private records, and there's no laws on how long they need to be kept. As a matter of fact, if you contact a funeral home, their willingness to cooperate with you is really up to them. They don't have to. So be nice, and you're probably going to have better results. But if the funeral home that you are interested in has gone out of business, you can check and see if maybe their records were obtained by a historical or genealogical society or a local public library. Sometimes they are. Also, if it was sold, check with the subsequent owner, because usually when a business like that was sold, the records were transferred to the new owner. So look for changes in the names too by the address. And again, city directories are really helpful for this, because you can kind of look for all of the different funeral homes or undertakers in a particular area. Now, obituaries are another thing that have been around for centuries, and people would write up when somebody had died in different ways that they could write things up. So you want to be sure that you look for obituaries, and newspapers is a great source. And I have a video about how to search through various newspapers and find those little newspapers that maybe you haven't found in other places. I'm going to provide a link to that at the end of this video. But I also want you to think about the funeral homes, because they frequently had some type of posting about people that had passed that they were servicing, especially more currently, as well as checking with the church, because sometimes their newsletters would talk about people that had passed from their congregation. All right, what are some records that maybe you haven't found that may pertain to your family member? They might be in the Social Security Death Index in the United States. And so you definitely want to check that, because that can lead you to further records. And then you also want to look at mortality schedules if you haven't been able to find the death date of your ancestor. And in the United States, we have federal mortality schedules in 1850, 1860, 1870, 1880, and 1885. Most of those are available on Ancestry and FamilySearch. Okay, what are some other records that maybe you hadn't thought about? Look at probate records. Probate records are the settlement of their estate. And some people may have written a will, some people may not have written a will, but they still had a probate. And one of the ways that you can find a death date on a probate records that a lot of people don't think about is, let's say somebody did write a will. The will is dated, and the will is dated when they were alive because they wrote the will. But then when the will is filed is after they've passed away. So you know they died sometime between when they wrote the will and when they filed the will. The other thing to keep in mind are guardianship records. Now, guardianship records were created when children that were minors, which usually, it varied, but usually meant under the age of 21, had lost their parent, particularly their father. And then finally, you want to look at property records if they did own property. When did their property get sold, and then who sold it? Now, what if all of these things are bombing out and you're not having any luck? Or maybe you don't know enough about where somebody died, you're not quite sure what to do. You want to look for other clues from other family members. If they had a spouse, when is the spouse listed as a widow? Either in census records or in tax records. If the husband's listed on all the tax records and then all of a sudden the wife pops and the husband's disappeared, then you know that he died in between those two tax years. But in a census record, you may see a woman's record where she's listed as a widow, but she's not really a widow. The husband's still alive. The spouse's death certificate can also state whether or not they are a widow or a widower. And then one of the other things to consider are those city directories. In city directories, sometimes we see a woman's name and you see WID of, which means widow of. So that's how they would be listed in a city directory. So that really tells you a lot. And sometimes you have city directories every year, so that can really narrow down your date of death if all of a sudden you see that pop up in a directory. And then of course you always want to check other family members' obituaries. The spouse's obituary or even some of the children's obituaries can state whether or not that particular person is surviving or not. So there are lots more records to find when you're looking for death records and lots of ways to go about it. So don't miss any of these overlooked records when you're looking for death information on your family members. Now this video here is the video I was talking about a free newspaper website where you can also see which newspapers were published. It's a great place to find those obituaries of places where maybe you weren't expecting them or maybe that you didn't realize there was a newspaper that existed. So give that one a shot. Good luck.